The issue of chemicals in the environment is a story about science, politics, and humanity's relationship with the planet. My name is Chris Hughes, independent scientist, and this is the Chemical Journeys podcast. Join me as we uncover the story of chemicals in the environment through conversations with individuals working in this space. So, let's get started. Hello, and welcome to the Chemical Journeys podcast. My name's Chris Hughes, and I'm here today with Libby Sommer. Thanks for joining me, Libby.
Thank you for having me.
No problem at all. I'm really excited about this conversation because I stumbled across Libby. I think it was on LinkedIn. I noticed that you were a fellow biodegradation enthusiast because you had that in your LinkedIn handle. And it's not often that people of that sort encounter one another, I don't think. So my interest was instantly piqued and I had to reach out to you.
Yeah, thanks for reaching out. I think that was around the time that I had just finished work for the Biomimicry Institute on biodegradation and textiles, and we put together these really simple guides for the industry, but I'm sure we'll talk more about that as we get into this podcast.
Yeah, and then another thing which I noticed from looking at your profile was that you had co-authored a paper with Bob Bovling at the EPA on designing small molecules for biodegradability, which is a
Yeah.
brilliant paper I was familiar with. And I had to tell you that we actually used that paper to develop a game that we played whilst exhibiting at several conferences in my previous role when I was working for Ricardo. So we developed this higher and lower biodegradation game using the scoring that were given to different molecular fragments according to their biodegradability within that paper. So it was really awesome to finally make that connection.
Yeah, that was so cool to hear about. That was really awesome.
Yeah, and right now you're working as an independent consultant on a number of different activities, right?
I am. Yeah, I'm currently an independent consultant working on broadly impact assessment. And I work primarily with apparel companies, but also in food and a few other industries to evaluate the impacts of products that companies are currently making or are trying to make. So a lot of times these are emerging technologies. The work that I do is definitely connected to my time spent at EPA. That's where I began my career in the chemicals office, and that's where Bob Bothling and I worked together under a program called Design for the Environment. And at Design for the Environment, we were identifying safer chemicals and making suggestions to companies that made chemical products, especially cleaning products, and providing incentives for them to switch to less hazardous, more rapidly biodegradable substances. Um, I later learned that a lot of the work that Bob did to help pull together that paper also came from someone I worked with later named Tom Federley, who I think you know too, Chris. And he's been a mentor of late of mine as I'm doing some of this work on biodegradation in textiles. So it's really fun to get to know him in a different context. He's former Procter and Gamble and went independent after retirement, and now I think he's fully retired. He's really out of it, but I am so grateful for the opportunity to work with him a little bit too.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I've heard of Tom Federley. He's obviously got a really great reputation in the field of biodegradation. I don't think our paths ever crossed, but it's with names like Bob Bovling and Tom's being retired, it seems like the timing isn't great because it seems like the world is waking up to the issues of chemical biodegradation and environmental persistence. So yeah, we
Totally.
really wish that we
Yeah.
had those folks on the team.
Yeah, I miss them both, but they're doing well. They're enjoying their retirement.
That's very good to hear. So you started off there talking a little bit about your background, and maybe we can just pick up from there. So, if you could tell us a bit more about your background, the kind of journey that's taken you to where you are today, your motivations around what you're doing, that would be great.
Yeah, I have an academic background in math and environmental science. So I took a number of different STEM classes, almost all the disciplines of STEM. But I've always been interested in business and the environment and how business can be a force for good. as opposed to a negative force. And that interest of mine came in part from my childhood, as I think it does for a lot of us. My parents were commercial beekeepers in the Midwest in the United States. And it was immediately apparent when we had major differences in climate from summer to summer and the impact on honey production. So the more rain there was, the more blossoms were available for the bees, and of course, more honey. It didn't take long to make that connection for me between a healthy environment and a healthy economy, and the reverse being true as well. In college, I had took this class that was super fascinating with the chaplain of the college, but it was kind of a broad course around environment. And that's where I learned more about some of the companies out there, like Ray Anderson and his company Interface. Is kind of a early example of putting a stake in the sand around sustainability and using that as a business differentiator. And I really got inspired by that idea. And I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do after college. So I went to grad school up in Boston. And that's where I met some folks working in green chemistry, including John Warner, who invited me to a conference and met more people there, and eventually got connected to the EPA. And I started an internship there. And that's where my world of my work in chemistry really began.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really good to hear how your kind of formative years there and talking about how business can be a force for good. It feels like in this day and age, that principle is being tested, at least sort of over in the EU in particular. There's kind of a
Yeah.
lot of anti-business sentiment growing, and I think it's linked to the challenges that we're facing now, the environmental challenges and broader kind of political critiques around our economic system, the capitalist system. I mean, do you see that same thing happening over in the States, or is there still sort of a strong sentiment in favor of business?
I think there's broadly what you read a lot in the media over here in the United States is companies pulling back on DEI, in particular, Target, Walmart, all kinds of companies, and trying to sort of appease a more conservative group that's, of course, risen to power with the most recent election. I also experience, particularly as an independent consultant, that there is still demand for this kind of work, and it's still important to companies. But it does feel like we're experiencing some sort of shift here in the US that is still playing out. I mean, there's no doubt that we need to stay connected between environment and economy. We need them both. They're both critical to the health of people. Um, but it is certainly, a challenging and evolving time right now. As I said, I think the good news is that it's not like this work has stopped completely. There's still demand for support to understand impacts, still demand for support to understand greenhouse gas emissions and toxicity and other impacts. And I think that's really important because when we make anything, when we, do anything, we have an impact. And impact isn't necessarily bad, but there are certainly ways that we who make products, when I say we, I mean people who make products, can reduce their impacts. And a lot of times those can have positive implications too, like more efficient use of resources. And resources are costly. I mean, in the apparel industry, dyes are notoriously expensive. The more efficient that we can be in something like a dyeing process, you use less water, which requires less heat to heat that up. And, that all is a positive cycle. So I am hopeful and optimistic that that kind of work will continue. But yeah, we still got a ways to go.
Yeah, you make the comment about the political situation. So we're in early January here, and so there's still a lot of question marks about how the coming weeks and months are going to play out for sure. And certainly with that, as you say, there's perhaps some downward pressure on the initiatives that are being taken to improve sustainability across the board, or maybe there's less emphasis on those things. But I suppose on the other hand, it feels to me like we have sort of reached a tipping point now with respect to public awareness of the impacts of human activity on the environment. And, another thing that's happening right now are these terrible wildfires that are taking place in California, which, when the wildfires, you know, affect Los Angeles in that way, then it's very hard to ignore that sort of thing.
Yeah, right. It's very visceral. It's really sad what's happening there, and really, I think shocking because we tend to think of wildfires being in more remote and rural areas in the United States. Lots of open land, especially out here on the west coast of the U.S. And when you see it in dense populated environment, that's even more shocking. I hope people are safe, and I hope that we have some good lessons coming out from that too.
Okay, well, maybe we can move on to some happier topics, perhaps, and
Hmm.
talk a bit more about the work that you've been doing on
Yeah.
the textile industry. So, in particular, I think we discussed previously a project that you were involved with the Biomimicry Institute. So, maybe you could tell us a bit more about that.
I'll share to you a little bit about how I got to that
Yeah,
place.
great.
I was at the EPA for 8 years, and during that time, I worked with a number of industries on, especially green chemistry. So became pretty familiar with toxicology and environmental fate and persistence, and felt comfortable with understanding those studies and trying to interpret them. In the progress of working with these various industries, I started engaging with the apparel industry through the Outdoor Industry Association, and Nike was a part of that. So I met some folks there, and I eventually moved out here to Portland, Oregon, and worked at Nike there for 3 years. And I worked mostly on chemistry related topics, legislation and regulation, and chemical hazard assessment, and working with suppliers to change practices around the management of chemistry. And then I left Nike and I joined Lululemon as an independent contractor, but I set up their chemicals program and was there for a little over 2 years, almost 3 years, working with Lululemon, which is maybe not as well known in the UK, but it's a fairly well known yoga and athletic brand here in North America. And they're based up in Canada. And then I had the opportunity to join a startup as their director of sustainability. And I ended up joining Bolt Threads in 2019, and did work across various areas of sustainability. I did a lot of life cycle assessments, chemical hazard work as I had done in the past, biodegradation evaluation, but also ran their human rights and social responsibility program, which entailed setting up a code of conduct for the company and doing evaluations and audits to understand areas of improvement and areas of compliance. And that was a great experience in a lot of ways. Now I still do a lot of that kind of work, but as an outside person, so working with startups and various organizations, particularly in life cycle assessment. Honestly, that's a lot of my work these days is in LCA. But I do like to think of myself as trying to help companies and my clients find the right tool for the job. Get not assuming that LCA is the right thing, or not assuming that chemical hazard assessment is the right thing, but helping to understand what is it that we're trying to evaluate or solve for, and then what's the right tool to do that, and how can we do that most efficiently. LCAs are often thought of as being pretty expensive, and they can be really expensive, but there's a number of ways to manage challenges like cost and timing, and so that's how I essentially help coach my clients through that process. Um, the
It's a nice suite of roles that you've had there. You're niching down within a niche, in terms of your niching and sustainability within the apparel sector, and then you've worked across these different organizations. So, I mean, maybe do you have any insights, contrast, let's say, between your time at Nike versus your time working in a startup or with some of these other clients? What is it that really strikes you between as the difference between these organizations, and what are the learnings that you're bringing to these organizations that you're helping now?
yeah, I mean, I think some of the differences are might be what you would expect in a large organization like Nike. We used to say it's kind of like trying to turn a ocean freight liner. It's really hard to change the course, but when you do, there's a fair amount of impact. Nike had, I think, 600 to 700 direct suppliers. And then if you look at levels beyond their direct suppliers, it was thousands upon thousands of different organizations. So there was quite a large supply chain connected to making Nike's products. At a company like Bolt, which is a small startup, we had two or three suppliers. It was very, very small. And so the impact isn't quite as big, but you can make changes, at least early on, much more quickly. And so there's a, a greater depth of assessment that's possible at a early startup. um, I think one of the things that I really want to take away from my experience is trying to help people understand some of the lessons learned, because there's a really important connection between startups and brands. I mean, a brand like Nike would have been a customer of Bolt. And in fact, our customers at the time were Lululemon, Adidas, Stella McCartney, and the luxury group Kering. So these are, well-known brands that are making a lot of product. And there's, I think, a large number of startups in the apparel world right now. I don't know how that is similar or different to other industries
Hmm.
at the moment, but fairly early stage of scale. And when I think about scale, I think about, is someone at lab, like they're doing that work at the bench scale? Are they at a pilot stage where they maybe have a larger scale facility? Are they getting closer to commercial? Most of the startups out there in this industry, in the apparel industry, are at the lab or pilot scale and working towards that commercial scale. And commercial is a really special place where things change dramatically and expectations change dramatically. And I see decisions being made within this industry, both by brands and startups, that don't really connect to the realities of those commercial scale requirements. And, one is delivery time, how close that material needs to be to the next stage of production. And and some of the startups who got really close to that have failed in the last year, in part because they are not closely connected to their supply chains. And so there's a bunch of issues. It's not just one thing often, but there's a bunch of issues. And I think, hindsight always being 2020, there's lessons that I try to share with my clients, both brands and startups, around how do we do this better so that we have a better chance of success. If the intent is to make a material that has a lower footprint and also is commercially viable, both of those being quite important, what are some important choices that we should make that will increase the likelihood of that happening? And we have sort of this pent up, oh, as I said, a lot of startups are sort of early and they're getting towards that commercial scale, and that's where the rubber is really going to hit the road. And so we'll see how that
Yeah.
progresses. But I think there's some important lessons to be learned across the industry.
Yeah, I think that's really tragic, isn't it? If an organization might fail simply because it hadn't lined everything up in a certain way that they run out of cash, I mean that seems
Yeah,
really unfortunate. Yeah,
yeah,
I've actually
yeah.
there's a couple of other people that I've been speaking to talking about these issues of working in startups or trying to bridge that valley of death from pilot to commercial scale. One, Claire Walker from Holly Firm, working in a company making surfactants, and the regulatory aspect and all the costs related to regulatory compliance, huge proportion of the cost that they were facing was a major barrier to them. And also speaking with Jen Vanderhoven
Interesting.
from the
Hmm.
Bio-Based and Biodegradable Industry Association in the UK, and there it seems that this is possibly the most fundamental challenge is making that leap from pilot to commercial scale for organizations in the bioeconomy. So, but I guess in your
Yeah.
case, yeah, in your case, do you have any reflections on that before I ask you another question about the nature of some of these startups?
it makes sense that other industries would be facing those same challenges. Because I think when we think about something being at commercial scale and the apparel industry, and you can kind of apply these requirements to other industries too, but we think about, okay, I can get it, in a very short delivery time. I can get that in the colors or the styles or the various options, customized options that I'm looking for. I can get it in the volume that I'm looking for. I can get it in the price that fits within my margins. Those are a lot of different things that, as you think about like an early technology that's still probably figuring out how to scale and make their production process more efficient, like they're not meeting that. And so we have this big gap between a pilot process and a commercial material. And somehow we've got to figure out a better runway for helping those technologies scale. And I think, as I mentioned, some of it comes down to decisions, like where are those factories going to be? And that has a big impact on things like delivery time. But also, I think the startups need to be thinking about where will I start customization of my material? And ideally, it's later in the process and not at the very beginning of your production process. And you can imagine why, like that's an important thing. There's also, I think, new supply chain sourcing models that
Mm,
um, need to come out to where right now a lot of times these innovations are just given to a sourcing team and they have their standard process. They want to know how much can I get, when will I get it, etc. And they're asking questions that they would ask any uh, existing commercial material vendor, but those questions may not necessarily be answerable by a
mhm,
startup. So we've got to figure out, how do we make it possible for the sourcing team to actually source the material, but also make it possible for some flexibility and some kind of inventive creation of product to happen in a way that you can use something that's new and not necessarily a drop in, not necessarily exactly like the thing that maybe it's trying to replace, but
mhm.
we need to think more creatively. Oftentimes that hasn't happened. It's just like you sort of get plopped over there and the sourcing team doesn't know what to do with the startup. That's where I've experienced some bottlenecks. There are really interesting financial models out there that I think could help solve some of those challenges. I'd like to see more of that happening and work in that area too. So I guess my interests are pretty broad from chemistry to finance, but I think that's what it takes to
Yeah, and
to
supply
make,
chain too.
yeah, that's what it takes to make these things succeed. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that's it. And you need people who can be jacks of all trades when you're working in these companies because they don't have the depth of expertise in house and they have to go based on a skeleton crew. I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you, given that you're working so much in the apparel sector, what are the drivers of innovation in these organizations? Is it all technology, performance related, or is sustainability kind of being a key driver of innovation for these companies?
I would say it's two things largely. It is performance innovation, things like temperature regulation and being a great example of that, especially if we're talking about sportswear, and sustainability too. For the particularly larger brands who tend to have like an innovation team that's scouting new technologies and ideas, they're looking for both. And that's been the case for probably since I joined the apparel industry, about 10 years ago, 10, 11 years ago. And probably it was continuing before that. But I think now it's even broader. It used to be just a handful of large brands and organizations that were looking for those types of innovations. And now I think it's much broader. Now you see smaller companies and small luxury companies looking not only for performance innovations, but sustainability innovations too. A number of those companies are in Europe, not surprisingly, and it's probably related in part to regulation, probably related in part to consumer changes and expectations. I think there's quite a number of companies that are looking at it from both angles, to be honest.
That's good to hear, and I'm not really surprised because the textiles and the apparel sector seems to have been facing quite a bit of heat recently on the sustainability front. With
Yeah,
kind of the issues
yeah,
around fast fashion, quality of clothing, and the lifetime of clothing, and then of course what it's ultimately made of and where it ends up. So perhaps you could
yeah.
give us a bit of an overview of that side of things.
Yeah, I think in the apparel industry, there's been a focus on sustainability for 30 years, I suppose. And in the 90s, it was really about labor. And you probably
Mm,
remember, um, I think we're of the age, Chris, where we remember some of those stories around sweatshops, as they were called back in that time, and large, well-known brands. Um, Having products produced in places where labor was underage or where they weren't being paid properly, or other conditions, working conditions that were just inappropriate and in a violation of basic human rights. And then in the early 2000s there was attention on chemistry, and that's how things like restricted substances lists came about. There was a series of articles in Europe connecting soccer players and potential reproductive impacts to the clothing that they were wearing because of some of the heavy metals that were in the screen prints on the soccer jersey. A bit of a leap, I would say, but it certainly catalyzed the creation of these restricted substance lists and a better understanding in the apparel industry of chemistry. And then 10 years later, there was a sort of another push at chemistry in the industry, with Greenpeace publishing reports linking the discharge of hazardous chemicals in factories across Asia to well-known brands like Adidas and Nike and H&M and so on. And so that led to, well, we need to go beyond RSL, which I think is true. The restricted substances lists are pretty limited, and there's thousands of substances used in textile production and more coming in through some of these innovations that we don't even really know about. So that's just responsible chemistry management in my mind, is understanding what are you using, what are the impacts, how do I mitigate that. That's really fundamental, I think, but still something that this industry is trying to get better at. And that's one of the reasons why I joined the apparel industry, by the way, is that I worked with all these different industries,
mm,
and that was the only one that I worked with that seemed interested in doing better and finding ways to solve problems and having a bit of humbleness about the challenges that we all face as society. And so that's why I joined the apparel industry. I was really compelled by that point of view. And I think that still continues
mm,
to this day. Most of the industry is still really interested in how do we do better.
mm,
Lately, a lot of the issues are centered around end of life, because as you mentioned, fast fashion, and now there's even something beyond fast fashion, like ultra fast fashion, where turnaround times are days or weeks, or it's just insane. It's kind of incredible to imagine. Nike had a production calendar that was 18 months for most products. So from the initial invention of the product, the conception of the product to the creation of it, it was 18 months. But ultra fast fashion is like a couple of weeks, and that scale is insane. I mean, what that results in is people using a lot more clothing and disposing of it much more quickly. In life cycle assessment, a great rule of thumb is that the longer you can use something, the lower the impacts. That is a very well-known kind of basic rule of thumb in LCA. And this is the opposite of that, right? We're using more and more products, and less frequently they get tossed out. A lot of times we think we might be recycling clothing, and it's the vast majority of it is going overseas to the global south, where they're inundated with clothing that they can't manage. Ghana, Accra, the capital of
mm,
Ghana, is an example that many of us in sustainability in the apparel industry are aware of in the last few years. There's so much clothing that's been coming in there. Initially, it surprised the Ghanaians, and so they called it dead white man's clothing, because they couldn't imagine that someone living would dispose of so much clothing. And they now have a big marketplace where there are secondhand resellers who refurbish or sort of change the clothing and sell it to the local population. But the country has something like 50 million people, and the estimate is that there's about 15 million garments coming into Ghana every week. So the amount of clothing coming in versus the population is just, that there's no comparison there.
Not really an
And so
outlet, is it?
yeah, and what you really see is landfills being completely overrun with clothing in Ghana, where they were previously fairly well managed, but with so much being dumped, there's just no ability to actually manage that in a good way. Um, and then the clothing gets washed into waterways around the capital. It covers the beaches, like it's literally tangled up within the sand. It covers the sea floor. It will get caught in fishermen's nets, like when
Mm,
they're trying to go out and fish. And these have, not only environmental implications, but human health implications from the people who are carrying the women who are carrying these enormously heavy bales of clothing back and forth to the market. The fishermen who boats sometimes capsize because their nets get tangled up in clothing. Like just the human cost is really atrocious, and
mm,
that shouldn't be the way that we operate. There's other examples too of this, like, and it's not, I don't want to belabor it, but the amount of clothing that we produce is pretty incredible. And we really need to turn off the tap for one, and find ways to use that waste as a resource. And that's where we're kind of finally getting around to the Biomimicry Institute. That's where um, I got involved with the Biomimicry Institute on a project that we called Design for Transformation. The idea was to take textile waste and turn it into new products that had a better health profile. So rather than recycling polyester to polyester, could we take polyester, break it down to monomers that could be useful in other more biodegradable products? And they did the project under Biomimicry Institute had a number of different pilots. There was one in Ghana, one in Rotterdam. And then my work was trying to better understand the biodegradation of textiles in general so that we could make better decisions and understanding in this industry, and also think about how could we design for the potential future breakdown of these materials, not only in the environment, but possibly in industrial systems,
mhm,
so that we can get back the resources that are put into these materials and then repurpose them, like a true circular economy.
mhm.
And the more that you have different avenues for repurposing those materials back to economics, the more attractive that can be, right? There can be multiple markets for using that waste material beyond just textile recycling. So that was part of the vision of that project.
Yeah, certainly the degradation of these materials, both in the environment or in man-made infrastructure, is going to potentially be very useful. So, can you summarize the main findings of the work that you performed there?
Yeah. So the pilot project in Rotterdam, which I was tangentially involved with, took mixed textile waste and took it through a series of processes to make other products beyond the polyester, cotton, nylon, and maybe a few other materials that were mixed in that. And there's a report on the Biomimicry Institute with a lot more detail about the research that was done there and the outcomes. And we're hoping to continue that kind of work under a different group that we're now calling Morpho Collective. So some more pilots to come, I think.
Mm,
My work it initially was going to be around testing the biodegradation of textiles, especially, of course, natural textiles, as we call them, like cotton or man-made cellulosics, that had been dyed with innovative dye stuffs, produced by a handful of startups. And um, for various reasons, that didn't work out, in part because a lot of the startups were very new in making their materials and couldn't really identify what they were producing. So we wanted to test biodegradation and also test toxicity. And we really needed to know more about the identity of the chemistry in order to do, especially the toxicity part of it. So what we ended up doing instead was I reached out to Richard Blackburn at Leeds University and worked with him and a graduate student to look at the literature on the biodegradation of textiles and the impact of chemistry. Because a very smart professor at Oregon State University once said to me, you know, textiles are like Christmas trees. You know, you have the tree, that's the fabric itself, and then we adorn it with all sorts of things, right? And you could use something like a popcorn garland, or you could use glitter. There's a wide variety of ways to change the look of that textile and or that Christmas tree. And that's what we do in textiles too, is to get different hand feels, to get different colors, to get different performance characteristics like wicking or water repellency, all chemistry. But we don't have a really good understanding of the impact of that chemistry on the eventual end of life of the material. And that's what we were trying to understand is what is that impact? What does the literature out there show about the impact? What we found in the literature was limited, not surprisingly, but I ended up separating the data that Leeds found into data around unmodified textiles, so that didn't have chemistry treatments, and textiles that did have chemistry treatments, and then also broke them up into natural and synthetic, not necessarily because of the original feedstocks, but because the biodegradation of those types of textiles is very different, right? Like nylon and polyester have very different biodegradation profiles than cotton or modal or tencel or something of that nature. And then I summarized the data in a way that was meant to be very accessible to this industry. So you don't have to go back to the peer-reviewed literature like we did and read every single report really closely. We just pulled out the most important pieces from those studies and tried to combine them. Sometimes there were several different studies looking at the toxicity of reactive dyes in cotton. So that was really helpful to then say, okay, what's the weight of evidence around the toxicity of reactive dyes in cotton as cotton breaks down? You know, so we're trying to make, kind of going back to that original paper around designing small molecules for biodegradability, that had rules of thumb around biodegradability, and we were trying to create something similar here. What are the rules of thumb based on the data that we can connect between the chemical treatments and these materials and their biological end of life in the environment?
Yeah, so it sounds like a great set of studies that you've done. So that those are available on the biomimicry website.
They are, yeah. The website, so it's under the Design for Transformation Initiative at Biomimicry Institute, and it's the letter D, the number 4T dot biomimicry.org.
That's great. Thanks, Libby. And yeah, just kind of capping off those findings, I guess it's a complex area, right? To try and untangle, pardon the pun, given that you have natural fibers, synthetic fibers, and then you have these additives as well. And with natural fibers being more
Um,
degradable, potentially higher propensity to release the additives that are contained within them, and still a lot of questions around the nature of the additives themselves and the
mhm,
potential risks that they might pose.
mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, and where there was data to address those questions, we included it. And overall, what we found is that there isn't a lot of data around the actual impacts, the toxicity of these additives in materials. There's some limited data on the reactive dyes that I mentioned. But what we do know from the literature so far is that both natural and synthetic fibers have that potential to, in different mechanisms, adsorb and release chemistry.
Mhm.
And so we shouldn't treat them necessarily as different. In fact, a number of researchers have said we really need to test them side by side to understand, is there a different potential, and is that a meaningful difference
Mm.
in potential to release chemistry as these materials are breaking down or being dispersant in the environment? One of the reasons why we wanted to publish these guides was, there are a lot of assumptions, which I think you have encountered too, Chris, around,
Mhm.
well, natural is obviously going to be better and synthetic is going to be worse. And, the story is often more nuanced than that. And I would say it's not only nuanced, but also we don't have the proper information yet to understand whether that's true or not in textiles, because we treat them with so much chemistry. All natural materials are treated with chemistry, all synthetic materials are treated with chemistry. It's just that's part of how this industry makes products. And um, so I think we're so used to looking at labels that say, 100% cotton or, 50% polyester, but that doesn't only tells a part of the story of what's actually in that product. And that's the piece that we're trying to shed some more light on, was the impact of everything else that happens after you make the grayish fabric, as it's called, and start to treat it with lots of different chemistry.
Yeah, no, it sounds like really great work. And just to respond to your comment around the assumptions that we have being tested, I definitely see that as well. There seems like there's been a lot of scientific progress happening in recent years, which are uncovering new issues, or at least new questions. I think that the global sustainability agenda in general is forcing a lot of areas where we've previously had consensus to be revisited. And as well, the overall progress of human development is perhaps bringing to light more issues as our economies grow and as we produce more stuff.
Yeah.
There's a role to be played here, and I'm sure you could comment on things that reduce the potential for these kinds of materials to be emitted to the environment throughout their use as well. So, and I think that links also to the overall quality of clothing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing the difference in quality of clothing. In Portland, Oregon, where I live, there's a pretty healthy culture around secondhand and thrift stores and consignment. I recently picked up a sweater that was secondhand, and I looked at the tag after I bought it, and it said it was from 1990, which I couldn't believe. One, that you
Wow.
could actually identify the date of a product, because that's not the case anymore, at least for the vast majority of products. But it surprised me in part because it was in such good shape. The color was still vibrant. It just looked pretty new, to be honest. And that, what, 34 years old.
Mm,
Like, that was just
impressive.
such an eye-opening, like, example to me of the difference in the quality between now and then, and how that, is connecting back to what we were talking about earlier, about just more and more stuff out there. There's an organization in the EU, the Microfiber Consortium, which is working on ways to reduce the shedding of fibers from clothing in particular. um, they have a pretty robust database of more than 1,000 studies analyzing the amount of shedding from various fiber types. And they're working on ways to change the production of materials to reduce fiber shedding, which is great. I think that's really good. I think we also have to acknowledge that clothing will shed no matter what.
Mm,
This is like one of the basic rules of physics, chaos, right? Everything tends towards chaos. So you're going to see some release of fibers from all clothing types. It doesn't matter what it is. Um, and so I think it's still really, really important to understand that potential toxicity, because we're going to see fibers out in the environment. Um, if you think about plants, trees, and grasses, and flowers, and anything out in the natural world, there's a lot of cellulose in those materials, or in those living species. And as they die and change, there's cellulose fibers coming off of natural materials and going out into waterways, into the environment. And we're not worried about the toxicity of that.
hmm
So it's not about the fact that it's out there, but it's about the fact that we've altered these fibers and then put them out into the environment.
hmm
So, are there ways that we can adjust how we're altering them so that we can reduce that potential for toxicity, knowing that there's going to be widespread dispersal of microfibers, regardless of what we do, regardless of whether we actually solve the overconsumption and overproduction, we're still going to see shedding from fibers. And that's okay. That's a natural process. But we need to better understand, is there impact or concern? And then how do we address that concern? And I think there's a data gap right now where there isn't sufficient information to understand, is really everything a concern, or are certain things a concern? And then how do we address them? And that kind of gets back to I guess, the work that I do in general, like, and trying to help people sort through complex questions like this and understand what is most important, and how do we address that? Because you can't address everything.
Yeah.
It's not possible. Um, but I think it is really important if your aim is to be more sustainable, to think about where are my biggest impacts and what is within my control to address, and where do I need to have more information to better understand those. Uh, my work is really around trying to help people navigate those kinds of questions, and I enjoy that. I definitely enjoy that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We do need to be able to prioritize with these things. There will be huge gains to be made in certain areas and only marginal gains or diminishing returns in investing time in other areas. That's just the nature of when you're trying to make progress with things.
Yeah,
Perhaps that helps us to move on to another topic, which is the work that you're doing on alternatives assessment, and in particular
yeah.
the A4 organization. Perhaps you could just tell us
Mhm.
a bit about what you're doing there.
Absolutely. That's connected to my time at the EPA, where one of the projects that we did within the Design for the Environment program was what we called alternatives assessment. These came about from EPA regulating certain substances like brominated flame retardants, and then the industry switching to alternatives that were maybe even worse or had similar hazards, environmental fate impacts. Uh, so the idea behind the Design for the Environment program was, again, understanding impact, identifying safer substitutes. So with a stakeholder coalition that would involve, if we're talking about flame retardants, we also did alternatives assessment on BPA and phthalates and but if we're talking about flame retardants, we identified a substance like DecaBDE, and its use in textiles and I think electronics as well. I don't remember exactly all the details, but we bring in stakeholders who were using those products to make their or using those flame retardants to make their products, like a Hewlett Packard, right? Or the furniture industry, or we'd work with the flame retardant manufacturers, Albemarle and others like that, and also NGOs, and identify, well, what is the purpose of this product? Like, what is its function? What are potential alternatives that are out there on the market? A lot of times those alternatives were a product with a brand name, not necessarily a chemical. And so what we did at EPA was we would get a confidential disclosure from the chemical manufacturer and then do a chemical evaluation, a toxicity evaluation. So looking at carcinogenicity and reproductive toxicity and aquatic toxicity. And, we had something like 18 or 20 different hazard and environmental fate endpoints that we would assess for every single chemical substance within that commercial product. And then the report that we published in conjunction with the stakeholder group would talk about the function and the purpose, and then go into the toxicology of these various alternatives. And what I was doing as part of that was creating criteria. Like, how do we determine if something is low toxicity versus high toxicity? What makes sense out there? And so we relied pretty heavily on GHS, but also brought in other types of criteria where GHS didn't really cover some of the hazards that we wanted to evaluate. Those reports and those criteria are still available on the EPA website. We did 5 or 6 different alternatives assessment reports on various chemistries and industries. And at that time, the EU was starting its work on authorization and trying to understand how to do effectively an alternatives assessment, right, as part of authorization. In California, they had just passed the green chemistry regulation, and so that was going to require alternatives assessments for various chemistries and industries. There's a group called Clean Production Action that had developed the green screen, which was a similar tool for evaluating and comparing chemical hazards and making determinations about safer substitutes. So then some of the folks involved in that world decided, well, let's have a professional society. Like, this is a very diverse field that requires toxicologists and environmental fate specialists, and really, I think, also should involve things like life cycle assessment. The idea is, how do we make informed substitutions instead of going from the frying pan to the fire, like Deca BDE, to a more hazardous or more persistent flame retardant? How do we make better decisions, and how do we make informed decisions? Because a lot of times, chemistry isn't perfectly low hazard. That's not
Mm.
how the world works. But if you have a better understanding of impacts, you can manage those impacts, and you can know what to expect, and um, and address them rather than being surprised. There's also a financial benefit to this. Hewlett Packard said it costs us $40 million to replace a chemical in our product.
Wow.
And this was probably 15 years ago. So who knows what it is these days? But they had all the incentives in the world to understand, if I'm moving away from this flame retardant in my product, what am I moving to? And is that likely to be regulated in 5 to 10 years? Because that's going to mean I'll need to spend this money replacing that substance rather than spending that money innovating and creating something that consumers can see rather than fixing a regulatory issue. So the A4 group is now part of SETAC. It's a new interest group. Anyone can join SETAC. Anyone who's already a member of SETAC can join the Alternatives Assessment Working Group. We've had a number of webinars under A4 on in vitro toxicity tools, for example, or how different industries use alternatives assessment. All of that is still on the A4 website. A4 is an Association for the Advancement of Alternatives Assessment, and those webinars are still available. We plan to continue more of that. Right, the group is deciding what our kind of key priorities are, one of which tentatively at the moment is, how do we get the next generation of people more involved in alternatives assessment? How do we get them to start to use this and really grow it as well across industries? One thing I think is really important is to make it faster
Mm.
and more cost effective. At Bolt, I would do a lot of alternatives assessment at the startup, and a lot of times I was working with needed feedback within a day. Like, it's hard to do a toxicology assessment within a day, but there are now amazingly some tools that at least can give you kind of a screening level understanding of impact, and that's hugely useful, especially when you're at the R&D phase. So yeah, open call to anyone to join the CTAC A4. It's a really interesting mix of people who come from government, academia, industry. You've got someone from Apple who's part of that group, CA. So there's a broad mix of folks there.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like an important function that we're really starting to develop now. I remember from my time in the past working on some projects, and I thought, we really need to help some organizations to find better alternatives to the substances that they're using. But it seemed that a lot of the times the knowledge gap that was there was linking to the actual performance of the substance itself in the
Yeah.
product, and connecting the disciplines of technologists, performance experts with risk assessors, toxicologists, etc. So, is the whole gamut sitting within this organization, or do you still have that a bit of a gap there to bring in the performance experts?
Um, if effectively it's within that
Mm.
organization. My experience again at Bolt at the startup was, in fact, because of my prior work doing alternatives assessment and looking at different chemical substitutes. Um, I was actually pretty well positioned to give feedback to our research teams on potential alternatives. I always came to the discussions with them with a lens of, what is this doing? Like, what are we trying to solve for?
Mm.
Um, Asking them as well to identify potential alternatives so we could evaluate the impacts. We had a really cool example at Bolt where we had a substance that in our life cycle assessment had a pretty high water footprint. And so I wanted to try to change that because I wanted to bring down the water impacts within our LCA. And we identified 3 alternatives that could have the same function. And the research team tested all 3 and found that one of them in particular actually worked better than the substance that we had been using. And when I looked at the LCA impacts, both the greenhouse gas emissions and water and chemistry, what I found was the several of the alternatives were better from a water and chemistry perspective at a certain dose, right? Like, because we had to take into account how much of that substance was being used. It's really also critical.
Yeah.
And one of the alternatives was highly hazardous, in fact, explosive. So we wrote that one off immediately. But the one that worked the best in the research team's trials was also the one that had the lowest hazard. So it was a very, you don't often get those sort of win-win-win situations, but it was great. It was lower from a LCA perspective. It had improved hazards. It improved the overall performance of the product. That was just a really fun example that kind of showed the power of combining performance with environmental impact, and not only chemical impact but also life cycle assessment too. That's the kind of thing that I want to keep doing more of, because I think ultimately that leads to informed decisions and better decisions, and led to something that was overall better for making our products too.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a really nice story of multidisciplinary collaboration to bring a better solution, which seems to be more and more these days where a lot of the gains are to be found in terms of bringing together people from different disciplines. We're so good working in our silos and getting really specialized in our silos, but these days we need to talk more, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
I wanted to ask you a question about, because within Europe, there's also the Safe and Sustainable by Design initiative, which seems to be being led by
yeah.
the European Commission. And there's a huge amount of effort and emphasis and drive with that initiative to make it work. And I took a look at that myself. I was invited to participate in a SETAC workshop. I think SETAC were
Mm.
provided a report as a stakeholder group to the commission. And I was looking at it as it, you know, there seem to be a lot of challenges in these sorts of activities, especially if they're going to come in at the SME level, where you're going to have
Yeah.
very complex assessments across many different areas to inform some of these SME companies, for instance. So, yeah, I guess the other comment or question is, how is A4 and the SSbD sort of crowds interacting in CTAC and beyond?
Yeah, several of the folks in A4 have been involved in various ways with safe and sustainable by design. Uh, Joel Tickner, who's a professor at UMass Lowell, has gone over to Europe a number of times and spoken, I think, with probably the EU Commission
Mm,
to tailor kind of the depth and preciseness of an assessment to where you're at. Like, if something
mm,
is early, does it need a really, I don't think it needs a really in-depth, precise evaluation. I think there's some really cool tools out there that can give kind of a quick evaluation that is still helpful
mm,
for overall design, but doesn't require the depth of resources that a robust like chemical risk assessment would require. Like that to me is uh, the most complex of any evaluation that one could do on chemistry is a risk assessment. But you can do a lot of things sort of earlier on that get at that idea, help screen and reduce impact. I'm not sure if SSbD is designed to incorporate that, but I
mm,
do think that should be a part of anyone's approach to sustainability and to chemistry in particular. It's true for with life cycle assessment too. I think there are wonderful rules of thumb around LCA that are maybe not commonly understood that can be applied early
mm.
before you actually spend, $50,000 or $100,000 to do a life cycle assessment. There's definitely ways to do early screening of impacts. And I'd like to see more of that. I think there's a little bit of hesitancy on by some folks who are really, expert in their fields, get comfortable with that idea. But the realities
Yeah,
are that can't we can't afford to do a robust evaluation at every single stage of scale,
yeah,
nor can we afford the time that it takes to do that. Again, like
yeah,
I had 24-hour turnaround times a lot of quite often with the research team, um, because that's when they needed to experiment with something. And so you can't you can't delay that and still expect to have buy-in for sustainability and impacts. And what's great is there are tools now that can
Mhm.
help people with those challenges. So it's not like this is an impossible thing at all. It's just, I think we need to be willing to accept less than perfect information and use it to screen. And then later, as something gets more standardized or likely to move forward, to look at it in a more in-depth way.
Yeah, I think those are very wise words that, there is a need for flexibility and to incorporate good practices in these kinds of activities, but being mindful of what is appropriate and achievable for the level of analysis that you're doing and the stage of development that you're at. I think that's really well put. Libby, this has been absolutely fantastic speaking with you today. Really interesting to hear all the work you've been doing, in particular on alternatives and around textiles. Before we wrap up, I have a couple of questions that I ask all my guests. But before I
Yeah.
say that, where can people find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn.
Mhm.
So Libby Sommer, it's SOMMER, the German spelling of summer, or at libbysummer.info. That's my business website that has a bit more information about me too.
So the first question the rapid fire, what is a big goal that you're working towards in the coming months?
This a more sort of standardized job is sort of a challenge, when you have a lot of time and flexibility, and that all of that is great, and it's also sometimes a challenge. So I'm working on getting a better routine as an independent consultant, and I've just hired a business coach to help me do that, which I'm really excited about.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I can totally echo what you say there about the challenges with discipline and everything else. I have also
Yeah.
been working with a coach recently, and I can attest that
Ah,
it works wonders. Let me know if you ever want to share stories about how to address some of those challenges.
please.
Yeah. The second question would be one piece of advice that you could give to yourself or somebody else starting out in their career today.
Mm. Someone kind of early in their career.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's so interesting how the world has changed in the almost 20 years that I've been in the working world. Um, it used to be that we would meet people in person at conferences, and there would be lots of in-person events. Some of that is coming back, but not in the way it was before 2020. And so I think that now requires young folks who want to find their path to be a bit more proactive with online avenues for reaching out. And LinkedIn is, the probably the number one way to connect with professionals at the moment. Um, I always appreciate it when I get requests from people who are early in their career that have some connection to what I'm doing. It's not just, oh, can we talk? But I've been to your website, or I saw this talk, or I read this, and I understand you work in this area. I'd love to talk more about X, Y, or Z. So I think the uh, number one, don't be afraid to reach out. Number two, make sure that it's customized
Mm.
to the person that you want to talk to, not just sort of a boilerplate. Um, because everyone has limited time, and many of us want to mentor and bring up the next generation, and we also don't have um, unlimited time to devote to that. Um, and what I would say too is you may not hear back from everybody. Don't get discouraged about that. I mean, I even reach out to people on LinkedIn who I may or not know. Sometimes, most of the time, I hear back, but sometimes I don't, and that's just, who knows? Who knows what's going on for that person? But don't let it bring you down. But keep doing that, because I think it's still the case that most jobs are found through connections. It's still the case that there are lots of unique roles in sustainability that are hard to understand until you talk to someone with that role. And so for people who want to get into a sustainability oriented sort of job, I think you have to talk to people in this field. And so don't get discouraged, but also be targeted, and be really uh, uh, make the connection personal so that they're more likely to respond.
Thank you, Libby. I could not agree more with what you just said. That's really good advice for anybody starting out. So thank you very much again, Libby. This has been absolutely fantastic. I'll also say thank you, everyone who's been listening. Your time is really precious, so I'm really grateful that you've spent it with us today. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please follow it, leave a comment, and spread the word about the Chemical Journeys podcast. We've got more conversations like this to follow, so I look forward to checking in with you next time. Thanks again, Libby.
Thank you, Chris. Great talking with you.